In a city where the past whispers through paper and the truth is buried between misattributed lines, one woman's final annotations spark a battle far colder than murder. When a forged will and a forgotten manuscript collide in the quiet halls of scholarship, Nero Wolfe finds himself entangled in a web of lies written in the margins. Some wars are fought with guns, others with ink. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. It wasn't my first cup of coffee, but it was the one I'd been planning to enjoy without interruption. The phone, as it often does in moments of modest ambition, rang before the second sip. I recognized the voice on the other end as belonging to Marcia Dean, brittle, breathless, and operating at a register just south of panic. "Mr. Goodwin? It's Marcia. This is about Eleanor. I need to speak with you." "Well, you're off to a roaring start. Consider yourself speaking. Is Eleanor all right?" There was a pause, the kind that suggests the speaker is not only choosing her words, but actively avoiding the real ones. "I can't say over the phone. Please, meet me at the Astor Library, Rare Books Room, as soon as you can." I glanced at the clock. 9:30. Wolfe wouldn't emerge from the plant rooms for another hour and a half unless the orchids spontaneously combusted. "What exactly am I walking into?" Another pause. "Just come, Mr. Goodwin. Please, it's urgent." She hung up before I could push further. That alone earned her a few points. Not trust, but curiosity. In our business, breathless voices rarely lead to fresh air. I'd met Marcia Dean once before, 6 months back, during a minor flap involving stolen letters and an estate sale with more emotion than assets. She'd struck me as one of those people who never quite knew whether they were afraid or angry. Now she sounded like both. The Astor Library isn't on my usual rounds, but it had the advantage of being public, patrolled, and unlikely to include sudden bursts of violence before noon. That's about as good as you can ask for in Manhattan. I didn't press Wolfe for clearance. He hadn't assigned me the case, and technically there wasn't one yet. But when someone who can't finish a sentence asks for a meeting in a room full of priceless paper, I figure it's worth seeing which paragraph she's afraid of. So I put on the brown hat and headed out. The day didn't smell like trouble, not yet. The Astor Library, for those unfamiliar with its charms, is a stone-fronted sanctuary for people who think silence is a virtue and dust is a sign of pedigree. It stands like a forgotten cathedral just east of nowhere, quietly housing more knowledge than most of its visitors will ever put to use. I walked in through the main entrance, was directed past the general reading room, and then down a corridor that smelled like history and varnish. The Rare Books Room was tucked behind a brass-handled door, flanked by wood panels that would have made an antique dealer weep. Marcia had said to meet her there. What she hadn't said, and I made a mental note to mention this later, was that I'd be walking into an active crime scene. A crowd had already gathered just inside the velvet rope. A patrolman was holding back a woman with more curiosity than tact. I caught a glimpse of navy blue and yellow tape through the frosted glass panels, and that low, ambient hum that hangs in the air when death has taken up residence. So much for calm mornings and quiet conversations. I gave my name to the officer guarding the door, flashed my license, and was waved through without ceremony. The Rare Books Room had been transformed from its usual whispering reverence into a scene of procedural muttering and official note-taking. 2 uniformed officers stood near the desk. One of them looked up as I approached, but didn't stop me. Apparently, I already looked like I belonged. Eleanor Vickery didn't, not anymore. She was slumped forward, arms collapsed on the desk like she'd fallen asleep in the middle of alphabetizing. But the angle was wrong, and the silence, too, still. Her face was turned slightly to the side, and there was a stiffness to the shoulders that only rigor and resignation can produce. There was no blood, just the odd peacefulness that sometimes follows the opposite of peace. Marcia was nowhere in sight, which, considering her call, didn't exactly inspire confidence in her timing or her motives. I scanned the room, noted a detective in shirt sleeves taking statements from a bespectacled woman with trembling hands, and moved closer to the desk. I didn't need to check for a pulse. Eleanor Vickery had already checked out. The desk in front of her was mostly clear except for a single sheet of paper, torn along the spine, yellowing at the edges, with handwritten notes in 3 different colors of ink. Someone had been revising, or revealing. I leaned closer. The top margin held the faint imprint of a library stamp. The bottom, however, was where the intrigue lived. Eleanor's script, small and precise, covered nearly every available inch, with numbered symbols that might have been page references or something more personal. I'm no scholar, but I know paranoia when I see it. Then I read the last line. If I disappear, start here. No signature, just the period, placed deliberately, like a door shutting behind her. Whoever had taken the rest of the book hadn't wanted this page found. Or maybe they had. Either way, Eleanor had tried to leave a trail, and someone had tried to smother it. I had no idea yet what the page was from, but I was willing to bet it wasn't Little Women. I straightened up just as a uniform stepped beside me and gave a nod toward the hallway. Ms. Dean's waiting. At last. The reason I was here, and the reason I might wish I hadn't been. She was sitting on a bench outside the room, hands clasped too tightly in her lap and eyes focused on a spot somewhere to the left of the floor. Her hair was pinned back, but one curl had escaped and hung awkwardly near her temple, like it had forgotten the script. "Marcia?" I said, softly, but not too softly. Her head snapped up. "Mr. Goodwin?" She tried a smile, but it came out as a wince. I sat beside her, not too close. "You called me. I came. Want to start connecting the dots?" I didn't know she was dead when I called. That wasn't what I asked. She swallowed. I thought she was in danger. She'd been acting strange for weeks. She said she was working on something important, but she wouldn't tell me what. And yet, she told you enough to bring me into it? She said... Marcia hesitated, then shrugged helplessly. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should speak to you. And Mr. Wolfe. The use of the full name wasn't lost on me. She wasn't playing casual, she was playing careful. And something about it was just a shade too polished. Inside the rare books room, the tension had shifted from solemn to bureaucratic. A detective with the kind of jaw that enjoyed saying classified was questioning the staff. I caught his eye, nodded politely, and turned back toward the desk. The torn page had no title, no chapter number, just the ghost of where a spine used to be. A young librarian, pale, bespectacled, and nervously fidgeting with a pencil, spoke up when I asked what book the page had belonged to. I believe it was a 17th century volume from the Morley collection, The Myth of Honor. It was catalogued just last week. Still here? He hesitated. No, sir. We can't find it. One page left behind, the rest missing. Someone had wanted Eleanor silenced, but someone else, or maybe the same someone, had made sure the story she'd been trying to tell was torn out by the root. I gave the room one last pass. The officers were still in note-taking mode and Kramer hadn't arrived yet, which meant I had a window. I stepped back to the desk, looked again at Eleanor's still frame, and then at the single page that had caused this much trouble. It wasn't just the content. It was the confidence of the notes, like she'd known exactly what she was uncovering and hadn't blinked while writing it down. The margin symbols weren't random. They followed a pattern, careful, repeated, exact. Eleanor Vickery had been trying to tell someone something. She'd picked Marcia. Marcia had picked me. And now Eleanor was dead. I folded my notebook, gave a brief nod to the ceiling, where Wolfe might have argued with gravity but not with reason, and stepped out into the cold. Whatever was on the next page, it had already cost someone their life. It wasn't hard to spot Inspector Kramer. He was stationed near the front of the rare books room like a bull planted in a china shop, chewing through a cigar and any illusion of quiet authority. His coat was off, his collar was open, and his voice was doing its usual job of rearranging the molecular structure of the air. "Goodwin," he growled when he saw me, as if I'd arrived with a contagious rash. "You always show up 5 minutes after the mess." "I aim to be punctual, not omniscient," I said, stepping over the velvet rope. "You've already diagnosed it?" "Dead. Quiet, not a mark on her." I glanced at the body of Eleanor Vickery and kept my reply to myself. I wasn't there to debate obvious facts or pretend Kramer was in a good mood. He jabbed the cigar in my direction. "If Wolfe sent you, tell him to keep his nose out of this one." "He didn't. Not yet." "Then make sure it stays that way." He turned on a young officer like a thundercloud looking for an open sky. The man flinched, and I eased further in, knowing Kramer's bark was still better than most men's full vocabulary. Dr. Lionel Halbridge had the kind of manner that made you want to check the stitching on your own suit. Tall, bespectacled, and shaped like an exclamation point, he stood by the far end of the room with his arms crossed in the classic pose of academic neutrality. His hair was orderly, his tone practiced. "A tragedy," he said when I approached, though not, I fear, entirely unpredictable. I raised a brow. Meaning? She'd been fragile for some time, anxious, paranoid. She spoke of threats no one else could see, entirely consumed by something she claimed to be uncovering. I tried to suggest rest. She declined. And now she's resting, permanently. He pursed his lips. I won't pretend to understand her state of mind, but I do know that obsession leaves people vulnerable. She may have succumbed to the pressure of her own imagination. I made a note of the way he didn't use the word suicide, but let it float in the air like an academic footnote, too distasteful for the main text. "Did you see her this morning?" I hadn't, no, but I expected something like this. It was only a matter of time. It was always remarkable what people were willing to predict after the fact. I took the long way back to Eleanor Vickery's desk. Not because I was feeling sentimental, but because sometimes the angles change what you see. Kramer had called it clean, and Halbridge had painted a picture of mental decline, but neither of them had leaned close enough to smell what I was starting to suspect, that Eleanor hadn't simply laid down her pen and spirit. Her body had stiffened in a way that didn't align with peaceful resignation. One arm hung slightly off the desk. The other was folded awkwardly beneath her ribs. The fingers had curled inward, but not uniformly. And there, half covered by the cuff of her cardigan, was the start of a shadow, not one made by light, but by force. I leaned down and adjusted the angle. A uniformed officer shifted his stance to watch me, but didn't interrupt. The bruise on her wrist was fresh, faintly marbled, and just beginning to bloom. Not enough to scream struggle, but enough to whisper it if you were willing to listen. The other wrist showed its twin. Not from a fall, not from collapse. It looked like someone had held her down. Briefly, precisely. I stood and smoothed my coat. The story was still missing pages, but this one had started bleeding through. Mental instability might have made for polite conversation in front of donors, but dead women don't bruise themselves in silence, not without help. I had begun to wonder just how many fragile reputations were being protected. Marcia Dean had drifted from shock to hysteria and was now hovering somewhere around theatrical disintegration. She'd been moved to a quieter corner of the library, but that hadn't dulled the sharp edges of her voice or the confusion on her face. "I should have done something," she said, gripping her gloves like they were life preservers. She tried to warn me. She said things, cryptic things about the past, about buried lies. I thought she was exaggerating. "Exaggeration doesn't usually come with physical bruises," I said gently, watching her reaction. She blinked hard. "What do you mean?" "Nothing I can prove yet." I offered her a handkerchief. She refused it, then seemed to change her mind, then used it without quite meeting my eyes. She said she was afraid of someone at the library. She give you a name? Number just that she'd found something, and that it had to come out. Did she ask you to bring me in? Yes. She said Mr. Wolfe might understand what it meant. That last line was too carefully placed, like a chess piece positioned in anticipation of checkmate. Either she was terrified or pretending to be, and I'd seen both lead to dead ends before. One of the younger officers, sandy-haired, square-shouldered, and clearly hoping not to make any independent decisions, stood near the side desk where the torn page had been catalogued. He glanced up as I approached and straightened like I'd pressed a button. "Sir, that page is from a rare volume," he said. "17th century from the Morley collection. We checked the catalogue." "What's the title?" "The Myth of Honor, Treatise on Forgery, Deception, and, Intellectual Fraud." "Popular topic these days," I murmured. He cleared his throat. "It was processed last week. First time it had come out of archival." "Still here?" He swallowed. "It's missing. That's the only page we found." The kid looked nervous. Maybe about the book, maybe about what it meant. Either way, a title like The Myth of Honor wasn't subtle, and neither was its sudden disappearance. I thanked him and made a mental note. Some books are stolen for money. Others are stolen because they say too much. Back in the cab, the name of the book wouldn't quit rattling around in my head. The Myth of Honor. It wasn't a common title, and it wasn't unfamiliar. Wolfe had a copy. I'd shelved it myself in the upstairs library 2 weeks ago, dust jacket intact and smelling like it hadn't been touched since Cromwell dropped dead. A coincidence? Maybe. But coincidences don't usually leave bruises and missing manuscripts in their wake. I told the driver to take me to West 35th and sat back. The timing was tight, the title was telling, and Eleanor Vickery had written the kind of note people leave when they know the ending's already written. Whatever had killed her hadn't been just fear or fiction, it had been knowledge, and someone's desperate need to keep it buried. I figured Wolfe might have something to say about that, or at least raise an eyebrow. He was, of course, in his chair when I returned. It was still morning, so the orchid rooms were off-limits. I gave Fritz a nod, crossed to the office, and found Wolfe with his hands steepled under his chin and his expression set to mildly disdainful. "Eleanor Vickery is dead," I said. "Library desk. No obvious trauma, but the bruises don't lie." He grunted. "Natural causes are never so cooperative. There's a missing book. That would be a matter for their catalogue." The book was The Myth of Honor. That stopped him. Not dramatically, Auntie. There was no gasp or theatrical flair. Just the faint upward motion of his left eyebrow, like an awning catching a sudden gust. "If she knew what that book reveals," he said quietly. "She was not merely cataloguing." I didn't press. I didn't have to. I'd seen that look before, the one that meant the case hadn't entered the office, but it had entered his mind. The only sound in the room, aside from the creak of Wolfe's chair as he adjusted his considerable bulk, was the scratching of his Mont Blanc against the pad. I'd made coffee, strong enough to insult a Swiss clockmaker, but Wolfe hadn't touched it. That was never a good sign. "I'd like to go see the library myself," I said. "You would," he replied without looking up. "But I prefer precision. Send Saul." "You think I'll miss something?" "Number. But you are by nature a vector for agitation. Saul is more absorbent." That was Wolfe's way of saying I stirred mud by stepping near puddles. He wasn't wrong, but I also didn't like being benched for a man who could vanish through a revolving door without disrupting the spin. Still, I dialed the number, Wolfe dictated, and Saul listened without interrupting. The title, The Myth of Honor, went down cleanly. The hunt, at least on Wolfe's terms, had begun. Victor Bram lived on the kind of block where rent came with a title and silence was purchased monthly. His place, part museum, part mausoleum, had carpets that had never seen a shoe without gilt and ceilings tall enough for judgment. He greeted me in a red cravat and an expression somewhere between insulted and intrigued. "You're with Mr. Wolfe," he said, as if it were a medical condition. "I'm Archie Goodwin, Wolfe's legs and ears. He sends his regards." I sincerely doubt that. He waved me toward a stiff-backed chair upholstered in something that had once been proud to be silk. The room smelled faintly of dried paper, oiled mahogany, and ego. "You hear about Eleanor Vickery?" I nodded. "You had a disagreement with her." "Over a book?" He snorted. It was not a disagreement, it was an act of intellectual piracy. "She came here under the pretense of authentication and swapped my 17th century Calder for a counterfeit. And I let her." I made a note. "Did you report it?" "Of course not. I have standards. I do not invite public laughter." Standards, ego, and a petty grudge. I had yet to meet a collector who didn't mistake paper for principle. Bram adjusted his cufflinks as if polishing his rage. I recognized the forgery within 24 hours. She had replaced it with a reproduction. Fine, yes, to the untrained eye. But she underestimated me. "And you didn't confront her?" "I invited her for tea the following Thursday. She didn't come." "Did you ask the library for the original back?" He lifted a brow, more offended than amused. "The library?" "Please, do you think they would admit it, that she would?" "No, Mr. Goodwin, I handled it my way." "And your way was?" "Silence, observation, patience." 3 things Bram probably excelled at in inverse proportion to their usefulness. I let the pause settle like dust on vellum. "Did you believe she meant to expose you?" "Expose?" He gave a short, sharp laugh. "She wouldn't dare. No, Eleanor was cautious, careful. She wanted something, not just from me, from history itself." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "She spoke of correcting records, reclaiming narratives. She believed some of these books had lies sewn into their very bindings." He said it like a man who'd been told he was fictional, and hated it. Tracy Vickery lived on the border between bohemian and curated collapse. Her apartment had sharp corners, bright colors, and the smell of citrus layered over something older. She opened the door like I was a salesman she might buy from if she liked the wrapping. "Yes?" "Archie Goodwin, I'm looking into your aunt's death." "Oh." She stepped aside, not quite inviting, but not resisting. "You can sit." "If you want." I did. She did not. She leaned against a bookcase filled with first editions that hadn't been read. "You were close with Eleanor?" She shook her head. "Not really. We were family, but not the warm kind. She was brittle, self-serious." "You're listed in her records as next of kin." "I suppose so. I didn't see her often." "Yet you're contesting the will?" Her lips thinned. "Because it doesn't make sense. She left everything to Marcia. The woman barely knew her." I made a note and closed the book, metaphorically. "You believe it was forged?" "I think Eleanor was manipulated. That happens when you get old and lonely." Her voice was calm, but her hands were not. They fluttered like moths reaching for something invisible. It was hard to say whether guilt was among them. The library staff room was located just far enough from the main floor to allow for whispering, but not escape. I made myself presentable and introduced my business to a woman named Celia, mid-50s, sharp chin, sharper memory. "Eleanor kept to herself," she said, arranging tea bags in a tin. "But she wasn't unkind, just observant, you know?" I nodded. I knew. She'd been spending late hours in the Special Collections vault, said she was cross-referencing old donor lists. Why? She said the records were wrong, that names didn't match dates, that someone had taken credit for something that wasn't theirs. "Anyone in particular?" She hesitated. "She didn't say, but there were rumors. Holbridge has critics." I leaned in. "You think she was looking to expose him?" "She was looking for the truth." "Sometimes that's the same thing." I left the room with more than I'd expected, not just about Eleanor, but about the institution. Libraries keep secrets better than most places, but even here, the dust talks. You just have to listen to where it settles and where it refuses to. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Saul was already there, his hat on Wolfe's desk, his face composed as always, like a man who made facts his furniture and moved only when necessary. He nodded at me, then at Wolfe. "It's a fake." Wolfe inclined his head. "Elaborate." "The library's copy of The Myth of Honor is a high-end forgery. Papers from the right period, but ink analysis shows recent application. The real copy, traced to a donor inventory from 1934, then vanished." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Convenient," Saul continued. "The forgery was likely swapped in the last 3 weeks, possibly by someone with catalogue access. That ruled out amateurs." Wolfe reached for his glass of beer, sipped, and said nothing. But I knew that silence. That was Wolfe digesting, not hops, but lies, and preparing to extract the truth with a scalpel. Wolfe spoke without lifting his gaze. "Forgery, Mr. Goodwin, is not always a question of currency. It is, more often, a question of existence." I waited. He looked up, eyes sharp. "To erase a truth, you need only paper. To fabricate a life, you need a motive. So what are we chasing?" "A forgery not of text, but of self," he said. "Someone has constructed a past to stand upon, and Eleanor, poor woman, was peeling away the floorboards." He frowned deeply. "And someone has now begun nailing them shut with poison." I said nothing. The silence agreed with both of us. If there is one thing in this life I've learned not to do, it's place objects into Nero Wolfe's personal library without running a background check on their grandparents. So when Saul confirmed, with a little too much brevity, that the copy of The Myth of Honor on Wolfe's own shelf had been skillfully forged, I didn't even look at him. I looked at Wolfe. He was in the red chair, motionless except for the index finger tapping the armrest. His eyes were fixed not on Saul or me, but somewhere in the air, the place where abstract affronts hang like storm clouds. "A forgery," he said at last, the words oiled and cold. "In my house." "It wasn't signed by the devil," I offered mildly. "It fooled the best of them." "I am not them," Wolfe replied. "And it did not fool me. It evaded inspection." "Which," Saul added gently, "was the point." Wolfe closed his eyes, inhaled slowly through his nose, and said, "I will not allow an imposture to sit undisturbed among legitimate truths. That, Mr. Goodwin, is actionable." I nodded. "Shall I assemble the cast?" "Yes," he said, his voice crisp, "but not as a courtesy, as a correction." If diplomacy had been my strong suit, I might have joined the Foreign Service. Instead, I spent the morning inviting 4 people who probably hated each other, and at least one of whom had likely committed murder, into a room where Nero Wolfe would be waiting to fillet them alive with verbs. Dr. Halbridge answered my call with the graciousness of a man correcting a misquotation. "Your employer is not an officer of the law," he informed me. "Nor an academic." "I see no reason to attend." "You've seen stranger reasons," I said. "You'll be here at 3. Victor Bram was more theatrical. "Is he accusing me of something?" "He's offering you the rare opportunity to speak without interruption. Try not to waste it." Marcia Dean hesitated, then agreed in a voice made mostly of breath. And Tracy Vickery, after a pause too long to be idle, asked only one question. "Will there be others?" "There'll be you and Wolfe. If you need protection, bring gloves." By noon, the invitations were out, the room was dusted, and Fritz had begun baking something aromatic to mask the scent of unspoken motives. I had no illusions. This wasn't a meeting, it was a siege. Wolfe's office, when arranged for what he calls a confrontation, takes on the aura of a court that has dispensed with robes and opted instead for fatigue and foregone courtesy. The red chair is centered. The others form a half-moon, not quite equal distance, and never quite comfortable. Holbridge arrived first, looking like he'd come to audit us. Bram followed, draped in tweed and indignation. Marcia, pale and fluttery, clutched a notebook as if it contained a map to escape. Tracy Vickery was last. She stepped in, surveyed the arrangement, and took the seat farthest from Wolfe with the practised grace of a woman who knows better than to be framed by velvet curtains. Wolfe didn't speak immediately. He waited for the silence to take root, for the discomfort to rise. When he finally turned his head, it was with the weight of a man who had already heard every word they would try not to say. "I have asked you here," he began, "not out of concern for your reputations, which are elastic, but because a deception, an intellectual vulgarity, has infiltrated my home." He paused. "I do not tolerate vulgarity, especially when it is bound in calfskin." "Really, Mr. Wolfe," Holbridge said, folding his arms like a lecture note, "this performance of yours, summoning people as if you were chairing a tribunal, is as absurd as your interest in matters beyond your field. You're not a scholar. You're not even a trained investigator." "Neither is gravity," Wolfe replied, "and yet it never fails to make its point." Holbridge flushed slightly. Academic red, the colour of a man unused to being interrupted with style. "You're conflating bibliographic gossip with criminal implication. This isn't a mystery. It's professional envy turned melodrama." Wolfe's eyes narrowed by a quarter inch. "Sir, I have had the misfortune of reading your 1946 monograph on Jacobean marginalia. If envy plays any role here, it belongs to you toward the truth you've adorned with fiction and footnotes." Victor Bram chuckled into his sleeve. Wolfe leaned forward. "Eleanor Vickery did not die because she imagined scandal. She died because she uncovered it. You may dismiss my qualifications, Dr. Holbridge, but you will not dismiss the evidence." He gestured toward the stack of annotated reproductions on his desk. "And when one is buried under false names, real ink will always bleed through." No one moved. Holbridge did not speak. That, for him, was violence. Victor Bram had been twisting his watch chain like it owed him money. Now he let go of it and leaned forward with the expression of a man who'd mistaken suspicion for certainty. "This is all quite theatrical, Wolfe," he said, his voice smooth but pitched too high. "You assemble us like chess pieces, point your fat finger at a dead librarian, and speak of forgery with all the subtlety of a tabloid. But let me pose a question. What if the forgery began with you?" That earned him a slow blink from Wolfe. "Nothing more?" "Yes," Bram went on, gaining steam. "You pride yourself on your rarities. Who's to say this wasn't arranged by you, a little bibliographic sleight of hand to embarrass your so-called peers? Eleanor Vickery may have been working with you. Perhaps she found the forgery for you." Wolfe lifted a hand and swatted the air with 2 fingers, not in anger, but the way one disperses a tiresome odour. "Mr. Bram," he murmured, "you mistake my intellect for appetite. I devour truth, not theatre." It wasn't the kind of rebuke that silenced a man, but it was the kind that made him realize he'd miscalculated his audience. Tracy Vickery, who had watched Bram's performance with the mild disapproval of a woman at a bad opera, uncrossed her legs and offered Wolfe a brittle smile. "My aunt," she said, "was an intelligent woman who allowed herself to be consumed by nonsense, margins, codes, conspiracies. It was all very Dan Brown before Dan Brown." Wolfe's lips twitched, not quite amusement, more a symptom of restrained contempt. "She saw ghosts," Tracy added, "and apparently died chasing one." "She didn't die," Marcia interrupted, her voice sharper than it had been all afternoon. "She was killed, and not by a ghost." The room turned slightly toward her. "I don't care what you think," she went on, staring at Tracy. "Eleanor told me someone at the library wasn't who they claimed to be. That's why she was digging. That's what she was writing about." Wolfe folded his hands and spoke softly. "Miss Dean, did she name them?" "No," Marcia said, voice trembling now. "But she left me a trail, and someone else knew." The silence that followed was not the quiet of reflection. It was the kind that masks calculation, the kind Wolfe always heard as loudly as a slammed door. Wolfe did not rise. He never does. But the tone in his voice as he ended the session had the quality of finality, not dismissal. "You may go," he said, "though truth will have us back in this room sooner than you'd prefer." Holbridge stood first, muttering something about wasted time. Bram made a show of indignant dignity, and Tracy slipped out with the cool glide of someone who'd said nothing she couldn't retract. Only Marcia lingered a moment, then followed, clutching her coat as if it could shield her from the next step. I stayed by the door until Wolfe sighed. "Well?" I asked. He didn't answer at once. Then, "When lies grow roots, Mr. Goodwin, they must be pulled with care, else the garden falls." "Charming. Shall I fetch the spade?" He closed his eyes. Wait, the weeds will move first." And they did. The call came just before midnight, interrupting a game of solitaire. I wasn't winning. It was Lieutenant Rowcliffe, which made the hour worse. "We've got a body," he said, "Upper West. Victor Bram. Natural causes?" "Natural as a guillotine." He gave me the address. I dressed. Wolfe didn't stir from upstairs, but I left a note, mostly out of courtesy, partially out of foreboding. Bram had been found in his private library, slumped in his favourite chair. The room was untouched, but beside him, on the floor, was a page. It had the same script, the same paper stock, and the same final line Eleanor Vickery had written before she died. "If I disappear, start here." I stood over him and felt nothing noble about symmetry. The game had escalated, but not changed. We had another corpse, another message, and the sense that someone was turning the pages faster than Wolfe liked. I've seen more interesting offices and more honest ones, but for a lawyer specializing in wills, Horace Lennon's space was just what it needed to be: orderly, odorless, and built to reassure wealthy clients that nothing would change after they died, except the address of their assets. "I have it right here," Lennon said, sliding a manila folder across his desk like a man unwrapping a mild surprise. Inside was Eleanor Vickery's revised will, dated exactly 1 week before her death. The original named Tracy Vickery as sole heir and executor. The new one did not. Marcia Dean had been given full control of the estate and any posthumous literary materials which Eleanor had labelled, with deliberate underlining, manuscript work in progress. Was she of sound mind when she signed this? I asked. Lennon didn't blink. Sharper than most people I've seen signing these things, she knew what she was doing and whom she was doing it to. It wasn't proof, not yet. But in Wolfe's terms, it was movement. Eleanor hadn't just feared something, she'd prepared for it with ink and intent. And in my experience, when people die with plans, it's because they've sensed they won't get to carry them out. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in mid-sip of his post-lunch beer when I gave him the update. He listened without comment, which is Wolfe's way of confirming importance without the inconvenience of gratitude. Tracy Vickery, on the other hand, had no such restraint. "I don't believe it," she told me over the phone. "A week before her death, it's absurd. She didn't even like Marcia." "You're saying it was forged." "I'm saying it's suspect. I'm saying she was manipulated." "And Marcia held the pen?" "I don't know," she snapped. "But if that's real, then it's the last real thing Eleanor did." She hung up without waiting for a reply, which was probably wise. Wolfe, overhearing, murmured, "If truth is forged, Mr. Goodwin, it often remains so until the next lie contradicts it." He didn't ask for Tracy's tone. He already had what he needed, interest where there should have been grief. Inspector Kramer entered the brownstone with his usual blend of noise and resentment. His coat was unbuttoned, his temper fastened. Fritz showed him in, which meant I had 30 seconds to brace for the weather. "Wolfe," he barked, holding out a file like it had personally insulted him. "You'll love this. Bram's death came back."
Wolfe didn't move, except to raise his eyes. "And? Suicide, official. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, empty brandy snifter. Cyanide laced in the rim." I glanced at Wolfe. He didn't even grunt. Kramer continued, pacing now. The page beside him? Same damn quote as the one found with Vickery. If I disappear, start here. So maybe the guy felt guilty. Possibly, Wolfe said, though unlikely. Mr. Bram would never surrender a spotlight he believed he deserved. You think he was murdered too? I think, Wolfe said with studied indifference, that poison is rarely poetic. When two deaths rhyme, they were written by the same hand, Kramer scowled. So you're saying it's connected? I'm saying, Wolfe replied, you brought me a conclusion. I prefer evidence. Which, given the company, was tantamount to a challenge served with mustard. Kramer was halfway through a sentence involving the phrase, overstepping boundaries, when Saul Panzer entered, folder in hand and face as mild as fresh linen. I have something, he said, which was how Saul always introduced dynamite. Wolfe tilted his head. Proceed. Saul handed over a typescript, pages copied from a draft, the margins thick with Eleanor Vickery's notes in her tidy, unforgiving hand. At the top, in pencil, for publication pending verification, final draft. The subject? Halbridge. Specifically, the questionable authorship of a monograph attributed to G.H. Latimer, published in the late 1930s, and, according to Eleanor's notes, entirely lifted from a now-missing thesis by a long-deceased library assistant. She was planning to expose him, Saul said. It's detailed, cross-referenced, and backed by internal memos she'd copied from the donor archives. Kramer swore under his breath. Wolfe, of course, merely adjusted the crease of his napkin. This, he said, is not revelation. It is confirmation. Mr. Halbridge is not merely ambitious. He is inherited fiction. I watched Kramer eye the pages like they might sprout fangs. Wolfe, meanwhile, had already begun parsing the annotations, not for what they revealed, but for what they implied Eleanor hadn't yet said. If you want the root of it, Saul continued, folding his hands, the original myth of honor, the real one, was donated to the Kirkendale collection in 1934. It disappeared during the reorganization of their archives in 1947. Disappeared, I echoed. Vanished, Saul corrected. 1 week after Halbridge was hired as a junior researcher, Kramer growled. That's not proof. No, Saul agreed. But it's pattern. The forgery surfaced under Eleanor's nose after Halbridge took control of acquisitions. She flagged inconsistencies and traced the watermark. The manuscript never left the donor record. Only the copy did. Wolfe sat motionless. That was his version of applause. She believed the theft was buried institutionally, Saul added. Covered to avoid scandal, but once she began checking donor letters, signatures didn't match. Wolfe nodded slowly. Yes, the usual disease. Reputation over record. Shame that prefers silence to redress. Kramer muttered, And you think Halbridge killed her to keep it quiet? I think, Wolfe said evenly, that men who erase provenance usually erase more than paper. And then, turning to me, Mr. Goodwin, bring me Eleanor's annotated folios. The hunt, if it hadn't already begun, had now turned into a dissection. The annotations Wolfe requested had been waiting in a folder labeled EV/marginalia. He reviewed them like a priest studying a dead language, one eyebrow twitching every few minutes, his version of suspense. Then he tapped the paper and said, This one. The note in question was brief, squeezed in beside a quotation from the disputed monograph. It read, The mistake is not in what he copied, it's what he corrected. Only the original author could have known. Wolfe looked up. This is the smoking sentence. She wasn't merely confirming theft. She was pointing to authorship. Halbridge? Undoubtedly, or rather, Latimer, his specter. Vickery found the seam in the disguise. And now she's dead. Yes. Wolfe pushed the page toward me. Because this correction was not an edit. It was a declaration. He sat back and closed his eyes. She gave them the choice. Admit the lie, or become it. They chose accordingly. Marcia Dean didn't enter. She hovered near the doorway like someone unsure whether stepping forward would trigger applause or gunfire. Her voice, when it came, was small but sharp around the edges, She told me everything. Wolfe opened his eyes. She was compiling names, records, connections. If she was gone, I was supposed to finish it, publish it. I moved to steady her, but she straightened on her own. She was going to expose them all. Now she's dead. Her breath caught. And I'm next. Wolfe didn't reply. He didn't have to. The game had revealed its next threatened piece.
If the Astor Library had a conscience, it lived somewhere in the sub-basement. That's where they kept the archives, floor to ceiling with the kind of paper that hadn't seen sunlight since Hoover's first term. It smelled like mildew, bureaucracy, and something older than either. Fred Durkin walked beside me like a man who'd been asked to inspect a furnace with a family secret inside it. He wasn't nervous exactly, just respectful, which in Fred's case meant he kept his hat on and didn't touch anything unless it glared at him. The staff didn't greet us, they observed, thin-lipped and wide-eyed, like stage hands waiting for a curtain to fall on something inconvenient. I flashed credentials, dropped Wolfe's name, and mentioned Inspector Kramer just to round out the tone. We were shown to the private research alcove where Eleanor had worked, a desk, a lamp, and a stack of unprocessed volumes thick enough to press a confession out of granite. The air was dry, the tension drier, and the fluorescent bulbs above us buzzed with a kind of hollow indecision, like they'd seen something and weren't ready to illuminate it. Fred looked at me and said, "What exactly are we hoping to find?" "Trouble," I said. "In ink." It wasn't long before we found Eleanor's mark, a stack of texts tied with catalogue tags and Eleanor's own red-tipped tabs. She had a system, and it didn't take a Rosetta Stone to spot it. Each flagged page contained a name, usually in the footnote, sometimes in the dedication, and each bore marginalia so tidy it looked printed. Phrases were underlined with surgical intent. Numbers were penciled next to author names, and in the side margins, a kind of breadcrumb trail, initials, page references, and what appeared to be a private shorthand, half linguistic, half numerical, wholly obsessive. Fred squinted at one passage. She was tracking patterns? Looks that way. But what do they mean? They mean someone lied in a footnote, I said, and she knew how to prove it. Most researchers underline for memory. Eleanor had been underlining for testimony. This wasn't annotation. It was an indictment in pencil. We moved through 3 volumes before it was clear. The names she marked weren't random. They orbited a theme, a literary motif of revisionist attribution, donor-era editing, and anonymous insertions. No smoking gun, but a gun-shaped shadow nonetheless. Fred said this wasn't research. This was excavation. And I agreed, only what she dug up was still breathing. I was halfway through a volume on 17th century historiography when Fred, bless his quiet diligence, tapped the table. "This one," he said. "Look." He pointed to the margin beside a name I'd seen twice before, G.H. Latimer. The initials E.V. were scribbled in Eleanor's familiar hand next to the number 3X, underlined once. "She marked this one multiple times," Fred added. I flipped back. He was right. Latimer had shown up in 3 separate sources, each time with annotations that grew sharper, more declarative. Beside the third she'd written, "Too many voices, same mask." Fred, never one for flourish, said, "I think she was telling us that name's a lie." It was more than a guess. It was a thread. And Wolfe, I knew, would be waiting for the tug. There are phone calls you make to report progress, and others you make because you've stumbled onto something that feels like a fuse. This was the latter. I reached Wolfe at the brownstone and gave him the name, G.H. Latimer. He's in 3 texts Eleanor flagged. She thinks he doesn't exist, or if he does, he's someone else. Silence for 2 seconds. Wolfe's version of applause. Then, yes, Gerald Hensley Latimer, used frequently in Halbridge's early bibliography. But he never received tenure, nor recognition, nor a footprint. You're saying Halbridge used his name? I'm saying Halbridge was that name, until it no longer served him. He paused. She was tracing the real origin of his reputation. back to the aliases that carried it. And she got too close. Yes, Wolfe said. Not to a truth that needed erasing, but to a lie that had become permanent. I hung up. The air felt heavier. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was seated beneath a lamp that cast him in bronze. He didn't gesture, so I spoke first. She was trying to undo him, I said, not just expose a theft, dismantle a career. No, Wolfe replied, not dismantle, reverse. Eleanor Vickery intended to push Halbridge's legacy back into the cave from which he'd dragged it. I handed him the marked texts. He barely glanced. These are the bones, he said, but her annotations? Those are the voice. He leaned back. This was not a crime of concealment, not truly. This was a crime of preservation. Halbridge did not kill to silence. He killed to maintain continuity. Eleanor threatened a narrative in which he was indispensable, and so he removed her, not to destroy truth, but to defend invention. That's a tidy phrase, I said. For murder. Wolfe sniffed. Murder is rarely untidy, Mr. Goodwin. Not when committed by scholars. They kill as they write, with edits. And then, softer. She did not die for discovering a lie. She died for treating it as corrigible. It was, in Wolfe's terms, an unforgivable mistake. It was the smallest line, and the most dangerous. In one of the margin notes, Eleanor had corrected a misquote. A passing Latin phrase cited in Halbridge's earliest paper under the Latimer name. Her note read, "Error not in translation, but source." Only the original author would have known. Wolfe tapped it with one forefinger. "This," he said, "is the point of no return." She proved he wasn't just borrowing the name. He was the name, and, Wolfe added, that he could not pretend otherwise. This wasn't plagiarism. It was authorship misattributed by design. He pushed the page back toward me. She didn't plan to expose him with volume. She intended to use precision, and that is always deadlier. I said nothing, because when Wolfe speaks that quietly, it means something loud is coming next. The call came from the library's internal line. A junior staffer had found another staff member slumped over Eleanor's old desk. Unconscious. Breathing, but barely. The annotated copies, Eleanor's notes, her tabs, her personal copies, were gone. I relayed the message to Wolfe. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, someone is not merely covering their tracks. They are removing the road itself. First the page, then the woman, now the witness. And soon, Wolfe said, the idea. I looked at the folder still on his desk, still marked in Eleanor's hand. She left her trail too wide, I said. No, Wolfe corrected. She left it too narrow, and now someone is trying to erase her, page by page, and person by person. The air felt thinner. The silence was no longer quiet, it was afraid. There's a certain choreography to a Wolfe confrontation, like staging a silent play where every chair is a spotlight and every cushion a confession. I had just finished setting the fifth seat when I paused to admire the symmetry. 5 chairs, all equidistant from Wolfe's desk. Not too close, not too far. The ideal range for discomfort and truth. I sharpened the pencils on Wolfe's tray, not because he'd used them, but because it suggested impartiality. Wolfe never took notes during a clash, but people felt more fairly ambushed if a fresh pencil stood between them and judgment. He hadn't spoken much that morning. He had breakfasted lightly, for him, and remained in the plant rooms longer than usual. When he finally emerged, his look to me said he expected performance, not improvisation. "You've wagered on an outcome, Archie," he murmured once, passing behind me. "Do I want to know the odds?" "Only if you're planning to hedge," I said. He didn't reply, but I noticed he'd moved his chair 1 inch closer to the desk. For Wolfe, that was a raised voice. And so we waited, the air already humid with expectation and the faint scent of polished malice. They arrived in staggered waves as though trying not to be caught arriving together. Halbridge was first, tight-lipped, grey-suited, and carrying the unmistakable aroma of prepared indignation. Then Marcia, pale as primed paper. Tracy Vickery followed, clinking with jewellery and the type of energy reserved for nervous triumphs. Last was Mr. Lionel Caldecott, a library trustee who looked like he'd been lured here with a forged memo and was now too polite to protest. Wolfe didn't rise naturally. He gestured toward the semicircle with the delicacy of a puppeteer encouraging the next act. They sat, uneasily, unwillingly, and instantly began to reposition themselves as not being quite as involved as the others. "I presume," Halbridge said, "this is some form of inquiry?" "No," Wolfe answered. "It is the inevitable conclusion of silence." Marcia flinched. Tracy's rings tapped against her glass. Caldecott cleared his throat like it was part of his resume. "I think," Caldecott began, "that as a representative of the institution I should clarify—" "You should listen," Wolfe said. "Clarification is premature." I watched them shift in their seats, predators unsure who'd already been shot, and Wolfe, of course, said nothing more. The silence did the shaping for him. "I propose we begin not with guilt," Wolfe intoned, "but with chronology, less biased, more revealing." He opened a ledger, Kramer's timeline, sharpened and corrected with Wolfe's own annotations, cross-referenced against hotel registries, archival logs, and 2 cab receipts I'd collected with quiet pride. He gestured to Halbridge. "You stated you were in Boston the night Eleanor died." "Yes." "A lie," Wolfe said. "You lectured at the Council on Modern Ethics the night prior." "Yes," but returned by rail the following morning. "The 3:05, which arrived at Penn at 6:10 p.m., you signed for your room at the Metropolitan Club at 6:35. Halbridge's lips parted, but chose no argument. "Miss Vickery," Wolfe continued, "you claimed not to have seen Eleanor for weeks." "I hadn't," she said, a little too quickly. Wolfe lifted one brow. "Then the copy of Letters to My Past Self, borrowed under your card from the Astor Library, returned the morning after her death, was borrowed by a ghost." Tracy looked toward Caldecott. He looked at the floor. Wolfe leaned back. "I do not ask for answers. The sequence supplies them." I watched their alibis die in order, not with drama, but with dates. Wolfe waited until they were half strangled by their own silence before placing the folder on the desk. "This," he said, "is what remains of Eleanor Vickery." He opened the file and laid out 5 photocopies. High-resolution scans of annotated margins. The same volumes Fred and I had combed, each page marked with Eleanor's initials, her unmistakable angular script, and a precision that spared neither attribution nor ego. Then Wolfe withdrew one more document. A page from Eleanor's revised will, unsigned but witnessed, dated a week before her death. I'd fetched it from the attorney's files under the polite camouflage of follow-up. Wolfe placed it beside the annotated margins. "The handwriting," he said, "is not merely similar. It is identical. Yet the legal community hesitates to authenticate it because it conflicts with the interests of those who prefer uncertainty." Caldecott blanched. Tracy bit her lower lip. "And so," Wolfe continued, "I acquired a second opinion, one unattached to the estate." He looked at me. I nodded and retrieved the envelope containing the analysis from Professor Emery Lackman, forensic graphologist and reluctant guest lecturer in modern crime. Wolfe tapped it once. "Eleanor Vickery did not forge a will, she preserved it. What was forged was time." Halbridge muttered something inaudible. Wolfe leaned forward just a fraction. "We are not discussing coincidence, we are discussing intention." And for a moment, even the paper seemed to breathe slower, as if waiting for its next name. Wolfe closed the folder, tapped it once with the flat of his palm, and regarded Tracy Vickery with the sort of judicial calm that makes a guillotine feel like due process. "Miss Vickery," he said, "is not who she claims to be." That earned a flinch from Caldecott, a blink from Marcia, and a perfectly timed clearing of the throat from Halbridge, who had evidently decided to change teams mid-inning. Wolfe continued. Your surname is accurate only in sentiment. In record, you were born Tracy Eleanora Stenwick, product of a liaison between George H. Latimer and a woman whose silence was purchased, not preserved. The room contracted. Latimer, Wolfe added, who later became the anonymous benefactor behind the library's Eastern expansion under the fiction of moral contribution. A fiction you have extended? Tracy opened her mouth, and then, wisely, shut it. You were placed near Eleanor not by fate, but by manipulation. An arrangement, I presume, designed to keep you close to the collection, and eventually its legacy. Wolfe leaned back. The only mistake, he said, was assuming Eleanor Vickery would die with her pen still capped. It wasn't quite a confession, but in the fine print of silence, it was the next best thing. Wolfe turned toward the copy of Eleanor's will still lying on the tray, now joined by the forged draft that had been discredited but not discarded. It is evident, he said, that Tracy Vickery, or Miss Stenwick, more truthfully, stood to inherit nothing from Eleanor's original testament. I could feel Tracy's posture tighten like thread on a spindle. But, Wolfe went on, if Eleanor were to be, how shall we say, prematurely departed, and a substitute will produced, one that better reflected family understanding, then suddenly a motive becomes both literary and legal. Holbridge bristled. You're accusing her of murder? I am identifying motive, means, and the manuscript of opportunity, Wolfe replied. The ink on the forged document mimics the exact brand used by Eleanor. The signature, while nearly impeccable, betrays a tremor inconsistent with her hand. He gestured toward the handwriting expert's analysis. The document is not only forged, it was meant to be convincing to someone emotionally invested, but not professionally equipped to challenge it. A librarian's death masquerading as inheritance. Tracy did not speak, but her silence made more noise than a broken window in a midnight alley. Tracy didn't collapse, she didn't faint, she didn't even reach for a handkerchief. What she did was worse. She laughed, bitterly, breathlessly. You think I wanted to be Eleanor's niece? She spat. You think it was some twisted ambition? That woman bled judgment. She wrote footnotes like accusations. She spent her whole life preserving words that were never hers. Wolfe remained silent. She didn't care about legacy, Tracy hissed. She cared about control. She gave everything to paper, not people. And I was supposed to sit in the wings and wait for her to die, quietly, obediently. I noted her hands, clenched, shaking, guilty. She had no children, no spouse, just ideas. And now you sit there, fat and smug, pretending you knew her better than I did. Wolfe blinked once. I never claimed intimacy, he said. Only evidence. And that, finally, broke the last unspoken thing in the room. Kramer had waited in the doorway like a man attending his own regret. When Tracy's voice faded into deflation, he stepped forward, hands in pockets, the eternal grimace carved deep. Well, Wolfe, he muttered, I'll be damned. You strung this whole thing together before your beer even hit room temperature. Wolfe inclined his head, the gesture of a monarch acknowledging dust. One day, Kramer added, your brain's going to get you locked up. Wolfe grunted. Possibly, but not for being wrong. He turned to me. Archie, what's for lunch? And that, as usual, was the real end of the interrogation. Wolfe had returned to his chair the way kings return to thrones, not because the war is over, but because it was never theirs to fight in the first place. He sat there, fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded, as though ruminating on a truth so inconvenient it had to be escorted by philosophy. Truth, he said, is the most fragile of instruments. It splinters when spoken, warps when remembered, and dies altogether in gossip. But in ink it becomes something else. I gave him space. He didn't like to be rushed in his reveries. A thought, once chased, had to come to him of its own will. He sniffed. Ink is a preservative, Archie. Not of sentiment, but of structure. Eleanor Vickery understood that. She died not because of what she suspected, but because she wrote it down. I raised an eyebrow. So it's dangerous to write. It's dangerous to clarify, he replied. But it is also the only defense against the infinite decay of meaning. He exhaled, long and slow. She did not die in vain. She published, posthumously. And with that, he let the silence reclaim him, as if even that needed filing. The morning air hadn't even decided whether to be spring or surrender when Wolfe made his usual motion, palm out, chin high, signalling departure to the plant rooms. But before he vanished into his floral cloister, he left one request hovering in the air like the scent of his yellow cattleyas. "The margin notes, Archie?" "The original?" I nodded. "For your files?" "For history's files. I am merely the intermediary." I fetched the folder from the cabinet, placed it precisely on the corner of his desk where the sun struck just enough to expose the age of Eleanor's script, the feathery indentations of thought under pressure. Wolfe didn't thank me. He simply carried the folder under his arm like scripture and disappeared into the green cathedral where truth didn't need cross-examination, only watering, pruning, and the correct temperature of respect. It's easy to think of war as noise, bayonets, bugles, bullets, the kind they write about in textbooks or carve on plaques too high for eye level. But Eleanor Vickery's war had none of that. No marching, no medals, just ink and silence, and the kind of loneliness that makes people talk to the margins of a book. She fought in the basement of a library most people forget has one. Her rifle was a pen, her battlefield, misattributed citations and invisible lines of theft. And yet she aimed better than most generals. She died before the last shot was fired, but she left the barrel warm. I sat in the office, the hum of the city just beyond the windows, and thought about how quiet victories rarely get parades. Her manuscript wouldn't make headlines, but Wolfe would preserve it, and maybe someone else would read it and remember she was right. She didn't win by surviving, she won by refusing to forget, even when forgetting would have been easier. And I guess that's what truth is sometimes. Not the thunderclap, just the whisper that stays after all the shouting has gone home. Marcia Dean arrived without fanfare. Just a soft knock and a file folder that looked heavier than its weight should allow. I opened the door, waved her in, and she sat like someone who'd just been released from a promise. "This is it," she said. I took the folder. Typed pages, no title on the front, no byline, just words, running clean and deliberate, like someone had written them to be read, not remembered. "I didn't change anything," she said. "I just finished typing what she'd started. I don't want credit." I nodded. I didn't say the obvious, that credit wasn't the currency Eleanor traded in anyway. "Do you want it returned?" She shook her head. "I want it read, that's all." Wolfe, behind his desk, didn't look up, but he extended one hand and I passed him the folder. He opened to the first page, glanced once, then closed it with the care usually reserved for rare editions or fragile lies. Marcia stood, lingered, and left. I didn't ask where she was going next. Some things, once delivered, don't need forwarding addresses. Inspector Kramer entered with the gait of a man who'd been invited to dinner and found himself at a eulogy. Again. He held a folded slip of paper like it might detonate. "You're officially off the welcome list," he grunted. Wolfe glanced up. "Where?" "The city archives. You've caused enough ruckus in one fiscal year." I raised a brow. "They afraid he'll reorganize the Dewey Decimal System?" "They're afraid," Kramer said, "that if he walks in again, 3 more skeletons are going to leap off the microfilm." He tossed the paper onto Wolfe's desk. "That's not a warrant, it's a suggestion. Take it or don't." Wolfe didn't pick it up. He didn't need to. Kramer's tone had said all it needed to, that truth was still truth, even if it made uncomfortable reading. Kramer turned and left. The door didn't slam, but it closed like punctuation. Wolfe didn't blink. Not at Kramer's indignation, nor at the bureaucracy now trying to bury the same truth Eleanor had uncovered with a typewriter and a throat full of nerves. "I do not go to libraries," he said, matter-of-factly. "I let them come to me." He meant it literally, of course. But there was something else in his tone, a faint inflection of melancholy or mirth, I couldn't tell which, like he knew the difference between knowledge and justice was measured in footsteps. He closed the folder Marcia had brought, placed it atop the others, and then stood, a rare motion performed with ceremony and the unspoken intention of ending all further discourse. He did not excuse himself. He simply exited, the door to the plant rooms shutting with the soft finality of someone who'd said what needed saying and knew nothing more would improve on the silence. Later that evening I filed the last note. It was a scribbled quote, half-inked, in Eleanor's handwriting, torn from the edge of an envelope. It said, "Memory fades, but margins remember." I placed it in the folder with the rest. An epitaph made of paper. Wolfe didn't speak again that night. And I didn't press him. Cases like these don't end in champagne or parades. They don't leave you cleaner, they just leave you quieter. Somewhere across the city, someone was probably reshelving a book under the wrong author's name. Somewhere else, a librarian might be writing truth in pencil, hoping it wouldn't get erased. And, somewhere deeper than either, a woman who refused to be forgotten had finally spoken loud enough to be read. I closed the drawer, straightened my chair, and clicked off the light. Somewhere between line and lie, the last page always tells. The ink has dried on Eleanor's final page, yet its echo lingers, an unyielding testament to a truth fought for in silence, marked in margins, and sealed with sacrifice. Justice, as ever, is a delicate balance between what is written and what is concealed. In the end, the quiet victories often weigh heaviest, and the faintest whispers can unravel the most intricate lies. What would you have done in Wolfe's place? Hold fast to logic, or surrender to the shadows behind the words? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.